On New Year's Eve, my daughter-in-law poured boiling wine down my hands. Early embalming, she whispered. I dried the burns. At midnight, she understood how it felt to lose her grip on everything. I should have seen it coming. After 40 years as a registered nurse, you develop instincts about people. You learn to read the micro-expressions that reveal true intentions, the body language that betrays hidden cruelty. But when it comes to family, we want to believe the best. We ignore the red flags because admitting the truth would shatter the illusion of love we've built our lives around. That December evening started like any other family gathering. I'd been living with my son Michael and his wife Cassandra for 8 months now, ever since my retirement from St. Mary's Hospital.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
The transition hadn't been easy. After decades of 12-hour shifts, of being needed, of having purpose, suddenly I found myself with nothing but time and an increasing sense that I was in the way. Virginia, could you help me in the kitchen? Cassandra's voice carried that particular sweetness she reserved for public moments, when Michael or the neighbors might overhear. I set down my book and followed her, my arthritis making each step a small negotiation with pain. The kitchen was warm, filled with the sense of the elaborate meal she'd been preparing all day. Cassandra took pride in her entertaining, in the way she could transform our modest home into something that looked magazine-worthy. She'd been planning this New Year's Eve dinner for weeks, inviting Michael's colleagues and a few neighborhood couples. Everything had to be perfect. I need you to strain the mulled wine, she said, not looking at me as she arranged appetizers on a silver tray. The guests will be here soon and I'm running behind. I moved to the stove where a large pot simmered with red wine, cinnamon sticks, and orange peels. The mixture had been cooking for hours, filling the house with its rich, spiced aroma. As I reached for the strainer, Cassandra stepped closer. You know, Virginia, she said quietly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, you've been looking tired lately, really tired, almost like you're fading away. Something in her tone made me pause. In my nursing career, I'd heard that particular cadence before. It was the voice people used when they were testing boundaries, probing for weakness. Medical professionals learn to recognize it because it often precedes violence. I'm fine, dear, I replied, focusing on the task at hand. The wine was scalding hot, steam rising from the surface in lazy spirals. Are you? She moved behind me, her presence suddenly oppressive in the small space. Because I've been thinking. You're what, 65 now? That's getting up there. Sometimes people your age, they start having accidents, little mishaps. Their hands aren't as steady as they used to be. My nursing instincts kicked in, every alarm bell in my head suddenly screaming. The way she positioned herself behind me, the calculated tone of her voice, the timing of this conversation when we were alone in the kitchen. I'd seen this pattern before in the hospital, usually in the files of elderly patients whose families weren't quite what they seemed. Cassandra, what are you? Her hands shot out, grabbing my wrists and forcing my hands down toward the pot. The movement was so sudden, so violent, that for a moment I couldn't process what was happening. Then the scalding wine made contact with my skin. The pain was immediate and excruciating. I bit down hard on my scream, some deep-rooted instinct telling me not to make noise, not to alert Michael and cause a scene. Cassandra held my hands in the burning liquid for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Oops, she whispered, her breath hot against my ear. Looks like Grandma had a little accident. Good thing I'm here to help with the early embalming. She released my hands and I jerked them back, cradling them against my chest. The skin was already blistering, angry red welts forming across my palms and fingers. 40 years of medical training kicked in automatically. Second-degree burns, possibly third in some spots. Immediate cooling needed, then proper dressing and pain management. Oh my God, Virginia! Cassandra's voice suddenly filled with false concern, loud enough to carry to the living room. What happened? Are you hurt? Michael appeared in the doorway within seconds, his face creased with worry. Mom? What's wrong? She reached for the pot without looking, Cassandra said smoothly, already moving to the sink. I tried to warn her, but you know how stubborn she can be. Here, let me get some cold water running. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, who should know me better than anyone. For a moment, I considered telling him the truth. But the burns were screaming for attention, and Cassandra was already playing her role perfectly, the concerned daughter-in-law rushing to help her clumsy mother-in-law. "I'm fine," I managed to say, though my voice shook, just careless. But I wasn't fine. As Cassandra guided my hands under the cold water, her fingers pressed just a little too hard against the burns, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. Satisfaction. She was enjoying this. In that moment, standing in the kitchen with my hands on fire and my son believing the lie, I realized something that would change everything. My daughter-in-law wasn't just cruel or thoughtless. She was dangerous, and after 4 decades of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer in hospital corridors, I knew exactly what I was looking at. Cassandra had just made the mistake of hurting someone who understood pathology better than she realized, someone who knew how to document evidence, how to read behavioral patterns, and how to build a case that would destroy her completely. The dinner party continued around my bandaged hands, but something fundamental had shifted. Every smile Cassandra gave me, every solicitous question about my comfort, only confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The dinner party was excruciating, and not just because of my hands. I sat at the far end of the table, my bandaged palms resting carefully in my lap, watching Cassandra perform for our guests. She was magnificent in her role as the devoted daughter-in-law, frequently asking if I needed anything, apologizing to everyone for poor Virginia's accident in the kitchen. "She's been so tired lately," Cassandra explained to Mrs. Henderson from next door, her voice carrying just the right note of loving concern. "I keep telling her to slow down, but you know how independent these older folks can be." Mrs. Henderson nodded sympathetically, glancing at me with the mixture of pity and awkwardness people reserve for the elderly who've become burdens. I'd seen that look countless times in the hospital, usually directed at patients whose families were already planning nursing home placements. "It happens to all of us eventually," Mrs. Henderson replied. "My mother started having little accidents too near the end. Depth perception goes, coordination suffers, it's just part of aging." I nearly laughed at the irony. Part of aging. If only she knew that my accident had nothing to do with declining faculties and everything to do with deliberate assault. But I held my tongue, using the evening to observe Cassandra more carefully than I ever had before. After 40 years in nursing, you develop what we called the eye. It's the ability to assess a situation quickly, to spot the warning signs that others miss. Tonight, I was using every skill I'd honed in emergency rooms and psychiatric wards to study my daughter-in-law. The first thing I noticed was how she controlled the conversation. Every time someone asked me a direct question, Cassandra would jump in with context or clarification. When Mr. Patterson from down the street inquired about my retirement, she answered for me. "Oh, Virginia's still adjusting to being home all day. It's been hard for her, hasn't it?" She turned to me with that saccharine smile. 40 years of being needed, and now suddenly all this free time. I think it's been overwhelming. The way she phrased it made me sound like I was struggling with purposelessness, when the truth was I'd been looking forward to retirement, or had been, until I moved in here and discovered what my son's wife really was. The second pattern I identified was more subtle. Cassandra had positioned herself as my caretaker in every story she told. According to her version of events, I was becoming increasingly dependent, forgetful, prone to mishaps. She painted herself as the patient, long-suffering daughter-in-law who'd taken on the burden of caring for her husband's aging mother. "Just last week she left the stove on all night," Cassandra confided to the table. "Thank goodness I got up early and caught it. Could have been a real disaster." I remembered that night clearly. I'd been heating milk for insomnia, something I'd done thousands of times before. When I finished, I distinctly remembered turning off the burner, but the next morning, Cassandra had made a show of discovering it still on, calling Michael in to witness my dangerous forgetfulness. Now I understood what had really happened. She'd turned it back on after I went to bed, then discovered it in the morning, creating evidence of my declining mental state. The third pattern was the most chilling. Every anecdote Cassandra shared involved some form of potential harm that she'd prevented or discovered. The stove incident, the time she'd found me confused about which medications to take, The afternoon I'd allegedly left the front door wide open, which she'd attributed to my wandering mind. I was witnessing something I'd encountered before in my professional life, but never expected to experience personally. Cassandra was systematically building a narrative of my incompetence and dangerousness. She was laying the groundwork for something, and my nursing experience told me exactly what that something might be. In the hospital, we'd seen cases of what we quietly called slow-motion murder. Usually it involved family members who wanted inheritance money or life insurance payouts, but couldn't risk the scrutiny that would come with an obviously suspicious death. Instead, they'd create a pattern of documented decline, of increasing accidents and health scares until the final incident that would appear to be the inevitable result of age and infirmity. By the time our guests left at nearly 1 a.m, I was certain of what I was dealing with. Cassandra wasn't just a cruel woman taking out her frustrations on an unwanted houseguest. She was actively working toward my elimination, and she was far more calculating about it than I'd initially realized. "Let me help you to bed, Virginia," she said sweetly as Michael finished loading the dishwasher. "You must be exhausted after such a long evening." "I can manage," I replied, but she was already at my elbow, her grip firm enough to guide but gentle enough to appear helpful. "Nonsense. With those poor hands, you shouldn't be trying to navigate the stairs alone. What if you fell? What if indeed?" I allowed her to escort me upstairs, acutely aware of how isolated I was in this moment. Michael was still in the kitchen. The neighbors had all gone home. And here I was being led up a flight of stairs by someone who'd already demonstrated a willingness to cause me physical harm. "You know," Cassandra said conversationally as we reached the landing, "Dr. Martinez mentioned at dinner that his mother went through something similar before they had to place her in memory care. The little accidents, the confusion, the safety concerns. It's really quite common." She was testing me, gauging my reaction to the suggestion of memory care, seeing how I'd respond to the threat of being institutionalized. "I'm not confused," I said firmly. "Of course not," she agreed, but her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that tonight, with the wine incident, and then telling Mrs. Henderson that story about your hospital days, that didn't quite add up. Well, sometimes stress can affect our thinking." I hadn't told any story that didn't add up. In fact, I'd barely spoken during dinner, thanks to her constant interruptions, but I realized she was creating false memories for Michael, who might overhear this conversation, planting seeds of doubt about my mental acuity. At my bedroom door, she paused. "I hope you know how much Michael and I worry about you. We just want you to be safe and comfortable. If there ever comes a time when this arrangement isn't working anymore, when you need more specialized care, we'll make sure you get it." The threat was delicately wrapped in expressions of concern, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. "Behave, stay quiet, don't cause problems, or you'll find yourself in a facility somewhere." "Good night, Cassandra," I said, stepping into my room and closing the door firmly behind me. Alone at last, I sat on the edge of my bed and examined my bandaged hands. The pain had settled into a steady throb, but it was manageable. More importantly, the burns were telling a story that contradicted Cassandra's version of events. The pattern of the scalding, the depth and location of the worst damage, the way the blisters had formed, all of it was inconsistent with accidentally grabbing a hot pot. Tomorrow, I would photograph these injuries. I would document every detail of tonight's dinner conversation while it was still fresh in my memory, and I would begin building the kind of comprehensive case file that I'd learned to create during my years working with social services and law enforcement. Cassandra thought she was dealing with a confused, helpless old woman. She had no idea she'd chosen to target someone who'd spent 4 decades learning to recognize and document exactly the kind of predatory behavior she was exhibiting. She wanted to play games with my life and safety? Fine. But she was about to discover that some games have consequences she never anticipated. The next morning, I woke before dawn with the methodical precision that had governed my nursing career for 4 decades. My hands throbbed, but the pain was secondary to the clarity that had crystallized overnight. I knew exactly what I was dealing with now, and more importantly, I knew how to handle it. Cassandra was still sleeping when I slipped into the bathroom and carefully removed my bandages. Using my phone's camera, I documented every burn from multiple angles, noting the pattern and depth in the same systematic way I'd once recorded patient injuries for medical charts. The evidence was damning if you knew how to read it. The scalding pattern across my palms showed clear directionality, indicating forced contact rather than accidental grabbing. The deepest burns were on the backs of my hands, where Cassandra had pressed down hardest. Most telling of all, there were faint bruise marks on my wrists where her fingers had gripped me during the assault. I photographed everything, then applied fresh dressings with the expertise of someone who'd treated thousands of similar injuries. As I worked, I mentally cataloged what I knew about my daughter-in-law's background, searching for the gaps that needed filling. Cassandra had married Michael 3 years ago, after what he'd described as a whirlwind romance. She'd been working as a medical receptionist when they met, which should have given her enough exposure to healthcare to understand injury patterns. Yet she'd made the amateur mistake of leaving evidence that contradicted her story. That told me something important about her psychology. She was arrogant, convinced of her own cleverness, but not actually as smart as she believed herself to be. Classic traits of what we'd learned to recognize as antisocial personality disorder. Over breakfast, I watched her interact with Michael, cataloging every micro-expression and verbal manipulation. She was subtle. I had to give her credit for that. The way she framed conversations to make me appear confused or difficult. How she positioned herself as the voice of reason while painting me as increasingly unstable. "How are your hands feeling this morning, Virginia?" she asked with perfect concern as she poured Michael's coffee. "I barely slept worrying about you. Maybe we should have Dr. Martinez take a look at them." Interesting. She wanted a medical professional to examine my injuries, which meant she was confident in her cover story. That level of confidence suggested this wasn't her first time orchestrating this kind of accident. "They're fine," I replied. "I've dressed worse wounds than this during my career." "Of course you have," she said smoothly. "But that was when you were younger. Our healing responses change as we age, don't they? And with everything else we've been concerned about lately." She let the sentence hang, but Michael picked up the cue exactly as she'd intended. "What kind of concerns?" he asked, looking between us. Cassandra hesitated, as if reluctant to voice her worries. "Oh, I don't want to make a big deal of it. Just little things. Memory lapses, confusion about daily routines. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make me wonder if we shouldn't have someone evaluate her overall health." I watched my son's face as he absorbed this information. The doubt that flickered in his eyes was like a knife to my heart, but it also confirmed something crucial. Cassandra had been working on him for months, gradually undermining his confidence in my competence. Last night's accident was just the latest piece of evidence in a case she'd been building systematically. "Maybe that's not a bad idea," Michael said slowly. "Dr. Martinez is a family friend. He could do a basic wellness check, just to make sure everything's okay." "I don't need a wellness check," I said firmly. "I need people to stop treating me like I'm losing my mind when I'm not." The flash of irritation that crossed Cassandra's face was quickly suppressed, but I caught it. She didn't like being contradicted, especially not in front of Michael. Another data point for my growing psychological profile. "No one's saying you're losing your mind, Mom," Michael said gently. "We're just concerned. Last night's accident, and some of the other things that have been happening." "What other things?" I demanded. Cassandra jumped in smoothly. "The medication mix-up last week, leaving the stove on. That afternoon you seemed confused about what day it was." Every single incident she cited had an alternative explanation, and I realized with growing horror that she'd been orchestrating all of them. The medication mix-up happened after she'd reorganized my pill dispenser to help me stay organized. The stove incident I'd already figured out. And the day I'd seemed confused about the date? That was the morning after she'd switched my blood pressure medication to a higher dose, because the pharmacy said the doctor had changed the prescription. I'd been experiencing mild side effects from medication tampering, and she'd been using those symptoms to support her narrative of my declining mental state. "I think," Cassandra continued, "it would be good for all of us to have a professional opinion, just to establish a baseline so we know what we're dealing with." The way she phrased it made me sound like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cared for. And the emphasis on establishing a baseline suggested she was planning to document my current state for comparison with future, presumably worse, evaluations. After Michael left for work, I found myself alone in the house with Cassandra for the first time since the attack. She was in the kitchen, humming softly as she cleaned up from breakfast, playing the role of contented homemaker. "You know," she said without looking up from the dishes, "I really think Dr. Martinez's evaluation is a good idea. It'll put everyone's mind at ease." "Will it?" I asked. She turned to face me, and for just a moment, her mask slipped. The expression I saw was cold, calculating, utterly devoid of the warmth she projected for Michael's benefit. "It'll establish that you're having cognitive issues that make you a danger to yourself and others. That last night's accident was part of a pattern of declining mental function. That you need supervised care for your own safety." There it was, the real plan laid out with chilling clarity. "And if I refuse the evaluation?" Her smile was razor-sharp. "Then I'll have to tell Michael about the other incidents you don't remember. Like the time you left the gas burner on without lighting it, or when you took double doses of your heart medication because you forgot you'd already taken it. Lucky for you, I caught both of those before anything serious happened." Neither incident had occurred, of course. But if she was willing to lie about them to Michael, she was probably willing to manufacture evidence to support the lies. And who would believe the word of an elderly woman with documented cognitive decline over that of her concerned daughter-in-law? "You're very good at this," I said quietly. "At what?" "At slow-motion murder." The phrase hung in the air between us like a diagnosis. Cassandra's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. She was reassessing me, trying to determine if I'd just made a lucky guess or if I actually understood what she was doing. "That's a very serious accusation, Virginia. The kind of thing someone with paranoid delusions might say." "Is it?" Because in my 40 years of nursing, I saw this exact pattern at least a dozen times. Family member creates documented evidence of an elderly relative's incompetence and dangerousness. Usually involves medication tampering, manufactured accidents, false reports of confusion and memory loss. The goal is always the same: make the eventual death look like the inevitable result of age and infirmity rather than deliberate harm. Now I had her full attention. The pretense of doing dishes was abandoned, and she was staring at me with the kind of focus a predator reserves for prey that's proven unexpectedly dangerous. "You think you're very clever," she said softly. "I think I know what you are. The question is, what are you planning to do about it?" For a long moment we stood there in my son's kitchen, two women who understood each other perfectly. No more pretense, no more manipulation, just pure, honest hostility. "I'm going to destroy you," she said finally, slowly, carefully, and completely. "And when it's over, Michael will thank me for protecting him from his delusional, dangerous mother." I nodded, accepting the declaration of war with the same calm I'd once brought to crisis situations in the emergency room. "You're welcome to try," I said. "But you should know that I've spent my entire career learning how to document evidence and build cases. You're not the first sociopath I've encountered, and you won't be the last." The word sociopath hit its mark. Cassandra's careful composure cracked, just for a moment, but it was enough to confirm my clinical assessment. She was dangerous, calculating, and utterly without conscience. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd chosen to target someone who knew exactly what she was and had the professional expertise to prove it. The war between us had begun, and I intended to win. The afternoon brought an unexpected ally in the form of a phone call from my former supervisor at St. Mary's Hospital. Dorothy Chen had been my head nurse for the last 15 years of my career, and hearing her voice felt like a lifeline in the isolation Cassandra had created around me. "Virginia, how are you settling into retirement?" Dorothy's familiar tone carried the warmth I'd been missing since leaving the hospital community. "It's been an adjustment," I replied carefully, aware that Cassandra was somewhere in the house and might be listening. "I bet it has. Listen, I'm calling because we have a situation here that could use your expertise. Remember the elder abuse protocols we developed together? We've got a case that's raising some red flags, and frankly, you were always better at reading these situations than anyone else on staff. Elder abuse protocols. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now living my own case study. But Dorothy's call reminded me of something crucial. I wasn't as isolated as Cassandra wanted me to believe. I still had professional connections. People who knew my competence and respected my judgment. "Tell me about it," I said, moving toward my bedroom for privacy. 82-year-old woman, brought in 3 times in the past 2 months by her daughter-in-law. Each time it's been something different. Medication overdose, fall downstairs, kitchen burns from confused cooking. The injuries are consistent with the stories, but something feels off about the whole situation. As Dorothy described the case, my blood ran cold. It was like looking into a crystal ball of my own future if Cassandra's plan succeeded. An elderly woman, isolated and discredited, suffering a series of escalating accidents that would eventually culminate in a death that appeared natural. "What does your gut tell you?" I asked. "That someone's systematically trying to kill this woman while making it look like age-related decline." The daughter-in-law is always the one who discovers these incidents, always has perfect explanations, and the patient seems terrified of her. But we can't prove anything, and the family has started shopping around for a doctor who'll declare her incompetent. The parallel to my own situation was so exact it made my hands shake, but it also crystallized something important. If this pattern was happening elsewhere, if other professionals were recognizing it, then I wasn't imagining things. This was a known phenomenon with documented characteristics. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something, and I need you to listen carefully without asking why right now. If you suspected someone was trying to build a case for incompetency against an elderly person, what would be the most effective way to counter that?" There was a pause. Dorothy had worked with me long enough to know I didn't ask hypothetical questions. "Comprehensive documentation," she said finally. "Medical records from independent sources, witness statements, photographic evidence of any suspicious injuries. Most importantly, establish a timeline that shows the pattern of incidents and who had access to the victim during each one. And if the perpetrator was systematically tampering with medications, blood tests to document current medication levels, analysis of any pills the victim has been given, medical evaluation by an independent physician who can assess actual cognitive function versus drug-induced symptoms." I was taking mental notes, building the framework for the investigation I needed to conduct into my own case. "Virginia," Dorothy said quietly, "are you asking for yourself?" The concern in her voice nearly broke my composure. Here was someone who knew me, who understood my capabilities, asking the question I desperately needed someone to ask. "I might be," I admitted. "Then you need to know something else. That case I mentioned? The daughter-in-law has a history. We did some digging, and she was involved in the deaths of 2 previous elderly relatives. Different states, different names. She remarried between incidents, but the pattern was identical each time." My heart stopped. "Different names?" "Yeah, she's had at least 3 marriages that we can trace. Always targets wealthy elderly in-laws. Always the same escalating pattern of documented incidents. Always manages to be somewhere else when the final accident occurs." "What name is she using now?" "Currently goes by Cassandra Webb. Before that, she was Cassandra Morrison. And before that, Cassandra Phillips. We think her birth name might be Catherine Weber, but we're still trying to confirm that." The room tilted. Cassandra Webb. My daughter-in-law had a history of exactly what I'd suspected, and she was working under what was probably not even her real name. "Dorothy, I need you to send me everything you can find on those cases. And I need you to keep this conversation confidential for now." "Of course. But Virginia, if you're in danger, you need to get out of that situation immediately." "I can't. Not yet. I need evidence that will stick, something that will protect other potential victims. If I run now, she'll just move on to someone else." After hanging up, I sat in my room processing this information. Cassandra wasn't just a cruel daughter-in-law or even a first-time killer. She was a serial predator who had perfected her methods through multiple murders. The burns on my hands weren't random cruelty. They were part of a documented pattern that had already claimed at least 2 lives. But knowing this also gave me an advantage. If she was following an established pattern, I could predict her next moves and prepare accordingly. More importantly, if there were previous cases, there would be evidence and possibly even witnesses who could corroborate what I was experiencing. That evening, Michael came home with news that made my stomach drop. "I talked to Dr. Martinez today," he announced over dinner. "He's agreed to do that wellness evaluation we discussed. He can see you Thursday afternoon." "That's wonderful," Cassandra said, her smile radiant. I know it will put everyone's mind at ease. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved, who was unknowingly facilitating his wife's plan to destroy me. The betrayal stung, but I reminded myself that he was as much a victim of Cassandra's manipulation as I was. "I'd prefer to choose my own doctor," I said. "Mom, Dr. Martinez has been our family physician for years. He knows your medical history." "Exactly," Cassandra added. "He'll be able to spot any changes from your baseline more easily than someone new." What she meant was that Dr. Martinez would be operating from the false baseline she'd been establishing through her manufactured incidents. Any cognitive issues caused by her medication tampering would appear to be legitimate decline rather than artificial symptoms. "I think I should get a second opinion," I said. "From someone who specializes in geriatric medicine." Cassandra's fork paused halfway to her mouth. This wasn't part of her script. "That seems unnecessarily complicated," she said carefully. "And expensive. Dr. Martinez is perfectly qualified to assess basic cognitive function." "I agree with Cassandra," Michael said. "Let's start with Dr. Martinez, and if he recommends a specialist, we can go from there." I realized I was trapped. Refusing the evaluation would be seen as evidence of my declining judgment. Accepting it meant walking into Cassandra's trap. But Dorothy's advice echoed in my mind. I needed independent medical documentation. "Fine," I agreed. "But I want the evaluation to be comprehensive. Blood work, cognitive testing, the full assessment. If we're going to do this, let's do it thoroughly." Something flickered in Cassandra's eyes. She hadn't expected me to embrace the evaluation, and my request for comprehensive testing clearly made her nervous. Good. If she'd been tampering with my medications, blood work would reveal it. "Of course," she said smoothly. "We want to be thorough." That night, I lay in bed planning my counterattack. Thursday's evaluation would either vindicate me or provide Cassandra with the ammunition she needed to have me declared incompetent. But I had 3 days to prepare and 40 years of medical knowledge to draw upon. I thought about the cases Dorothy had mentioned, about the pattern Cassandra had apparently perfected. Serial killer wasn't quite the right term. She was more like a serial poisoner, using the medical system itself as her weapon. She turned doctors into unwitting accomplices and families into co-conspirators, all while maintaining the perfect facade of concerned caregiver. But she'd made one crucial mistake this time. She'd chosen to target someone who understood her methods, someone with the knowledge and connections to fight back. And unlike her previous victims, I wasn't isolated and defenseless. I was a medical professional with a network of colleagues who would listen to me and help me build the case I needed. Over the next 3 days, I would document everything, gather evidence, and prepare for battle on her chosen battlefield. Dr. Martinez's evaluation would become the test that revealed which of us was really the expert at reading people and building medical cases. I was no longer just fighting for my own survival. I was fighting to stop a serial killer who had been hiding behind the facade of family care for years. And I intended to use every skill I'd learned in 4 decades of nursing to take her down. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Dr. Martinez's evaluation was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and Cassandra had been unusually solicitous all week, bringing me tea, adjusting my medications, to make sure you're comfortable for the appointment, and suggesting I might want to rest more to be at your best for the doctor. Each gesture of care was actually another piece of her strategy. The tea contained mild sedatives that would make me appear sluggish during cognitive testing. The medication adjustments were designed to create confusion and memory lapses. Even her suggestion to rest more was calculated. She wanted me isolated and drowsy, easier to manipulate during the examination. But I'd spent the past 3 days preparing my own strategy. Dorothy had expedited the information about Cassandra's previous identities, and what I'd learned was horrifying in its methodical precision. Catherine Weber, aka Cassandra Phillips, aka Cassandra Morrison, had a 20-year history of marrying into families with elderly relatives, then systematically destroying them through manufactured medical crises. Her first victim had been her husband's grandmother in Oregon, The death certificate listed natural causes, heart failure following a series of strokes, but medical records showed a pattern of increasingly frequent emergency room visits in the months leading up to her death, all involving medication reactions and falls that occurred when only Cassandra was present. The second victim was more recent, her previous mother-in-law in Nevada. This time, the cause of death was listed as complications from dementia, but again there was a documented pattern of rapid cognitive decline that began shortly after Cassandra moved into the household. The woman had gone from independent living to complete incapacitation in less than 8 months. Now I was her third target, and I understood exactly how she operated. She used the medical establishment's own protocols against her victims, creating paper trails that supported narratives of natural decline, while systematically poisoning and gaslighting her targets into helpless confusion. But this time would be different. This time, she was dealing with someone who understood her methods and had spent 3 days preparing a counteroffensive. At noon, 2 hours before the appointment, I excused myself to use the bathroom and instead slipped into the kitchen where Cassandra was preparing my calming tea. She was grinding something into powder and stirring it into the cup, probably a benzodiazepine that would make me appear cognitively impaired during testing. Instead of confronting her, I quietly documented the scene with my phone's camera, then returned to the living room and accepted the tea with grateful thanks. But instead of drinking it, I waited until she left the room and poured most of it into a small specimen container I'd taken from my nursing supplies. The rest I diluted with water from a hidden bottle I'd brought upstairs earlier. When Dr. Martinez arrived, I was ready. Cassandra had coached him extensively about my symptoms, the confusion, the memory lapses, the dangerous behavior that suggested advancing dementia. But she'd underestimated both my knowledge of cognitive testing and my ability to perform under pressure. "Virginia, how are you feeling today?" Dr. Martinez asked as we settled in his office. Cassandra had positioned herself as my concerned caretaker, notebook in hand to document my responses. "I'm feeling sharp, actually. Sharper than I have in months." Dr. Martinez glanced at Cassandra, who was frowning. This wasn't the response they'd expected. "Let's start with some basic questions. Can you tell me what day it is?" "Thursday, January 4th, 2024. The appointment is at 2 p.m., and I'm here because my daughter-in-law is concerned about my cognitive function." "And how would you describe your memory lately?" "Excellent, particularly for recent events. For instance, I remember exactly what happened on New Year's Eve when Cassandra deliberately poured scalding wine over my hands. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Dr. Martinez looked confused, while Cassandra's careful composure began to crack. "Virginia," she said with a nervous laugh, "we've discussed this. You reached for the pot accidentally. You were confused about what happened." "No, I wasn't confused. You grabbed my wrists and forced my hands into boiling wine while whispering about early embalming. I have photographic documentation of the injury pattern, which is inconsistent with accidental contact." I pulled out my phone and showed Dr. Martinez the photos I'd taken of my burns. His expression grew increasingly serious as he examined the images. "These injuries?" he said slowly. "The pattern suggests forced contact rather than accidental grabbing." "Exactly. And I have 40 years of nursing experience reading burn patterns. I know the difference between accident and assault." Cassandra was no longer smiling. "Doctor, this is exactly what I've been concerned about. She's become paranoid, creating elaborate fantasies about people trying to hurt her. It's a common symptom of advancing dementia." "Is it?" I asked. "Because I've also discovered that my daughter-in-law isn't who she claims to be. Her real name is Catherine Weber, and she's been married at least 3 times before. Her previous 2 mothers-in-law died under suspicious circumstances after exhibiting the same rapid cognitive decline she's been trying to manufacture in me." Dr. Martinez's pen had stopped moving. He was staring at me with the kind of focused attention medical professionals reserve for crisis situations. "I have documentation," I continued, pulling out the folder Dorothy had compiled. "Medical records, death certificates, police reports from Oregon and Nevada. The pattern is identical. Elderly relatives who go from independent living to death in less than a year, always with Cassandra as the primary caretaker, always with a history of medication reactions and accidents that she's the sole witness to. Dr. Martinez, Cassandra said desperately, you can see how elaborate these delusions have become. She's created an entire conspiracy theory around normal family caregiving. This is precisely why we need to establish competency parameters. But Dr. Martinez was reading the documents I'd provided, his expression growing darker with each page. After a few minutes, he looked up at me. These are very serious allegations, Virginia. But I have to ask, why are you sharing this information with me instead of law enforcement? Because I need medical documentation first. I need blood work to prove she's been tampering with my medications, cognitive testing to establish that I'm mentally competent, and a paper trail that contradicts the narrative she's been building. I pulled out the specimen container with the T sample. I also need this analyzed. She gave it to me this morning, claiming it would help me relax for the evaluation. I believe it contains benzodiazepines intended to impair my performance during testing. Dr. Martinez took the container, his professional demeanor now fully engaged. Cassandra, I think we need to postpone this evaluation pending some additional testing. That's ridiculous, she snapped, her facade finally cracking completely. You're letting her paranoid fantasies derail a legitimate medical assessment. She needs psychiatric intervention, not encouragement of her delusions. Actually, Dr. Martinez said quietly, I think she needs protection. Virginia, I'm going to order comprehensive blood work, document your burn injuries officially, and have this T sample analyzed by our lab. I'm also going to recommend that you not return home until we have the results. The moment stretched between us like a wire about to snap. Cassandra's face had gone through several transformations: confusion, anger, calculation, and finally, cold fury. You don't understand what you're doing, she said to Dr. Martinez. She's manipulated you just like she manipulates everyone. She's a sick old woman who needs supervision, not enablement. I'm a registered nurse with 40 years of experience, I replied calmly. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I know exactly what you are. For the first time since I'd known her, Cassandra's mask fell away completely. The woman staring at me across Dr. Martinez's office was a stranger, cold, calculating, and utterly without conscience. This isn't over, she said quietly. No, I agreed, but it's the beginning of the end. As we left the doctor's office, I knew the real battle was just beginning. Cassandra's plan had been disrupted, but that made her more dangerous, not less. Cornered predators were unpredictable, and she still had access to Michael, still had her established narrative of my declining mental state. But for the first time in months, I wasn't fighting alone. Dr. Martinez believed me. The evidence was being documented, and Dorothy's network of medical professionals was standing by to help. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself that my mind was sharp, my instincts were correct, and my professional skills were intact. Cassandra had underestimated her target. She'd assumed I was just another confused elderly victim, easy to manipulate and destroy. Instead, she'd chosen to hunt someone who knew how to hunt back. The war between us was far from over, but the first major battle was mine. The safe house Dorothy had arranged was a small apartment complex specifically designed for healthcare workers and their families in crisis situations. As I unpacked my few belongings in the modest studio, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine safety. No one was watching my every move, calculating how to use my actions against me, or plotting my systematic destruction. But the relief was temporary. Within hours of my leaving with Dr. Martinez, Cassandra had launched her counterattack. Michael called my temporary phone number in tears. Mom, what have you done? Cassandra is devastated. She's been nothing but loving and patient with you, and now you're spreading horrible lies about her. The pain in my son's voice was genuine, which made it harder to bear. Cassandra had spent 3 years conditioning him to see her as the perfect wife, the devoted daughter-in-law who'd taken on the burden of caring for his difficult mother. My sudden departure and accusations must have seemed like the ultimate betrayal. Michael, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your wife is not who you think she is. She's upset, Mom. Really upset. She keeps saying she should have seen the signs of your paranoia earlier, that she failed me by not getting you help sooner. Even in crisis, Cassandra was masterful. She was flipping the narrative, painting herself as the victim of my delusions while positioning my accusations as evidence of my mental deterioration. "Has she shown you any documentation to support her claims about my behavior?" I asked. "She doesn't need to. I've seen the confusion myself, the accidents, the way you've been acting lately. Michael, what if I told you that every single incident you witnessed was manufactured, that the medication mix-ups, the stove left on, the confusion about dates, all of it was orchestrated to make you believe I was losing my mind?" There was a long pause. "Mom, that's a really serious accusation. Why would she do something like that?" "Because she's done it before. To at least 2 other elderly women in previous marriages. Michael, your wife is a serial killer." The words hung in the air between us like a terminal diagnosis. I could hear my son's breathing, shallow and rapid as he processed what I'd just told him. "That's impossible," he said finally. "I know her. I've lived with her for 3 years. She's not capable of something like that. Neither were the families of her previous victims. She's very good at what she does." Over the next week, while lab results were being processed, and Dorothy's network of colleagues verified the documentation from Oregon and Nevada, I watched from a distance as Cassandra orchestrated her response to my escape. She was playing the role of heartbroken daughter-in-law perfectly, telling anyone who would listen about my sudden psychological break, my paranoid delusions, my dangerous accusations against someone who'd done nothing but love and care for me. She organized a family meeting to discuss my crisis, invited our neighbors to share their concerns about my recent behavior, and even contacted a psychiatrist to discuss involuntary commitment procedures for elderly patients with aggressive paranoia. But she'd made a crucial miscalculation. In her focus on discrediting me, she'd overlooked the fact that other people were now investigating her background, and when you're running from a history of serial murder, the last thing you want is professional scrutiny of your past. The first crack in her facade came when Dorothy's colleague in Nevada contacted the detective who'd worked her previous mother-in-law's case. The officer had harbored suspicions about the death, but lacked evidence to pursue criminal charges. When presented with the pattern Dorothy had identified, he agreed to reopen the investigation. The second crack came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez's lab analysis of my T sample revealed not just benzodiazepines, but also trace amounts of digitalis, a heart medication that in small doses causes confusion and memory loss, but in larger doses causes cardiac arrest. Cassandra hadn't just been trying to sedate me for the evaluation. She'd been slowly poisoning me with a substance that would eventually kill me while appearing to be natural heart failure. The third crack was the most damning. My blood work revealed a cocktail of medications I'd never been prescribed, including antipsychotics that would explain the confusion and disorientation I'd been experiencing, and blood thinners that would make any accidental injury potentially fatal. But it was the fourth piece of evidence that brought everything crashing down. Michael called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice shaky and strange. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Did Cassandra ever give you medication that I didn't know about? Pills or liquids that she said were supplements or vitamins?" My heart started racing. "Why are you asking?" "Because I found something in our bedroom, hidden in her jewelry box. Bottles of prescription medications with your name on them, but they're medications you've never taken. Morphine, insulin, potassium chloride, and there's a notebook with what looks like dosage calculations and timing schedules." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Cassandra had been building up to the final phase of her plan, the accidental overdose that would appear to be the tragic result of my confused self-medication. The morphine and insulin would cause respiratory depression and coma, while the potassium chloride would stop my heart. To any medical examiner, it would look like a desperate elderly woman had mixed her medications in a moment of dementia-induced confusion. "Michael," I said carefully, "you need to call the police right now. Don't confront her. Don't tell her what you found. Just call them." I already did. They're on their way. 3 hours later, Dorothy called with news that both vindicated and horrified me. "They arrested her an hour ago. The police found enough evidence in that bedroom to prosecute her for attempted murder, and the Nevada detective is filing charges for her previous victim's death. But Virginia, there's more." "More?" They found journals, detailed records of all her targets, including you. She documented everything: the medication tampering, the staged accidents, the psychological manipulation tactics. It's like she was keeping score. The journals, as it turned out, revealed the true scope of Cassandra's activities. She hadn't just killed 2 previous victims. She'd attempted to murder 5 elderly relatives across 3 states over the past 15 years. Some had died, others had escaped when she'd been forced to move on for various reasons, but all had suffered the same systematic destruction I'd experienced. More chilling was her psychological profile of each victim, including me. She'd identified me as high risk because of my medical background, but had believed she could overcome my knowledge through careful manipulation and medication-induced confusion. She'd underestimated my professional network and my ability to recognize and document her methods. The trial took place 8 months later. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through every aspect of her methodology, explaining how she'd used the medical system as her weapon and family dynamics as her cover. Dorothy and several other nursing colleagues testified about the pattern they'd identified, while detectives from 3 states presented evidence of her crimes across multiple jurisdictions. The most devastating testimony came from Michael himself. My son, pale and shaken, described finding the hidden medications in journals, the realization that the woman he'd loved and trusted had been slowly murdering his mother while he watched. The betrayal he felt was visible to everyone in that courtroom. Cassandra maintained her innocence throughout the trial, claiming that I'd manipulated the evidence to support my paranoid delusions, that the medications had been planted, that the journals were forgeries, but forensic analysis proved otherwise, and the pattern across multiple states was too consistent to be coincidental. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led her away, Cassandra turned to look at me one final time. The mask was completely gone now, replaced by the cold fury of a predator who'd finally been caught. But there was something else in her expression, a kind of professional respect, one expert acknowledging the skills of another. She'd lost, but she understood exactly how and why she'd been beaten. The aftermath was complicated. Michael struggled with guilt and self-recrimination, tormented by the knowledge that he'd unknowingly facilitated his wife's attempt to murder me. We attended family counseling together, working through the layers of manipulation and gaslighting that had poisoned our relationship. "I should have seen it," he said during one particularly difficult session. "I should have protected you. She was a professional manipulator," I replied. "This is what she did for a living." None of us were equipped to recognize what she was until it was almost too late. Gradually, painfully, we rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of honest communication rather than the false harmony Cassandra had enforced. Michael learned to see me as I really was, a competent, intelligent woman who happened to be his mother, rather than the burden his wife had trained him to perceive. I returned to work on a consulting basis, helping hospitals and law enforcement agencies develop better protocols for identifying elder abuse. The case had revealed significant gaps in the system, ways that predators like Cassandra could exploit medical procedures and family dynamics to commit perfect murders. Dorothy and I co-authored a paper on serial elder abuse in healthcare settings that became required reading in nursing schools across the country. We wanted to ensure that future healthcare professionals would be equipped to recognize the signs we'd nearly missed. But the most satisfying outcome was personal. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter from a woman in Arizona whose mother-in-law had been saved because a nurse recognized the pattern we'd documented. The nurse had read our paper, identified the warning signs in time, and alerted authorities before the situation escalated to violence. Cassandra's intended final victim, me, had become the key to stopping her permanently and protecting future targets. I still live independently in my own apartment, surrounded by the professional achievements and personal relationships that Cassandra had tried to erase. My hands bear faint scars from that New Year's Eve attack, but they've healed completely. More importantly, they're steady and sure as I continue working to protect other elderly people from predators who would exploit their vulnerability. Some nights, I think about the alternate timeline where I hadn't fought back, where my nursing instincts hadn't kicked in. where I'd allowed Cassandra to successfully gaslight me into helpless confusion. In that timeline, I would have died alone and frightened. Another natural death attributed to age and infirmity. Instead, I'm here to tell this story, to warn others about the signs of systematic elder abuse, to remind families that love without respect is just another form of control, and to prove that knowledge and experience don't become irrelevant with age, they become more valuable because they're tempered with wisdom. Cassandra thought she was dealing with a confused, helpless old woman who could be easily manipulated and destroyed. She discovered too late that she'd chosen to hunt someone who knew how to hunt back. In the end, her clinical precision became her downfall. She documented her own crimes so thoroughly that prosecution became inevitable once the pattern was recognized. The same methodical approach that had made her successful for 15 years ultimately provided the evidence needed to convict her. The nurse in me appreciates the irony. In medicine, we're taught that proper documentation is essential for good patient care. Cassandra's meticulous records, intended to help her perfect her killing methods, instead became the instrument of her own destruction. She'd spent years studying how to murder elderly people, but she'd never bothered to study what happened when one of those elderly people fought back with 40 years of professional knowledge and a network of colleagues who believed in justice. That oversight cost her everything. And it saved not just my life, but the lives of future victims who will never know how close they came to becoming statistics in her carefully documented killing spree. Sometimes the best revenge is simply surviving long enough to tell the truth.